On 2nd September 2025, inside York Crown Court, 3 young men stood before the judge. They were barely in their 20s, yet they had built a reputation that made them feel unstoppable. For months, they had been running what they called the CJ Line, a drug network that funneled cocaine into Scarborough's streets. To them, it seemed like easy money, fast power, and instant respect. But behind the scenes, detectives were watching every move, piecing together the evidence that would tear their empire apart. The irony could not be clearer. While they believed they were climbing to the top, their downfall was already in motion. What made them think they could outsmart the law? How could they imagine that flooding a small community with cocaine would go unnoticed? This is the story of Scarborough's CJ Line, and how ambition, arrogance, and crime led 3 young men straight into the hands of justice. Scarborough is known for its seaside charm, but beneath the surface, the town has wrestled with a growing drug problem. Like many communities across the UK, the demand for cocaine had quietly taken root. Dealers saw an opportunity, and small networks began to compete for control. It was in this environment that the so-called CJ Line was born, run by 3 young men who thought they had found the perfect formula for fast money and influence. Their method was simple but effective. Using mass text messages, they advertised cocaine as if it were a casual product. The messages went out to dozens of phones at a time, offering availability, prices, and quick delivery. For users, it created an illusion of convenience. For the gang, it was a way to spread their reach without showing their faces. They branded themselves with confidence, believing the code name CJ Line gave them an air of power and control. But the effect on the community was anything but harmless. Families noticed younger people being drawn in, police reports began to rise, and residents grew increasingly alarmed. Cocaine was not just being sold to hardened addicts. It was filtering into everyday circles, leaving a trail of broken trust and rising tension. What might have seemed like clever marketing to the gang was, in reality, poisoning the fabric of Scarborough. The arrogance of their operation added to the danger. They sent messages openly, confident that no one would dare challenge them and that police resources were stretched too thin. Yet the very system they relied on to grow, their constant stream of texts, would eventually become the evidence that tied them to the crimes. At the time, though, they believed they were untouchable, convinced that Scarborough was theirs for the taking. The CJ Line was more than just a number. It represented a shift in how drugs were pushed into small towns. Dealers no longer needed street corners or hidden alleys. They had turned mobile phones into their new marketplace. For Scarborough, it meant a constant intrusion of crime into the most ordinary lives, and for detectives, it became the first clue in unraveling a network that thought it could never be caught. Every crime network has its key players, and Scarborough's CJ Line was no exception. At its center were 3 men, each young, each convinced that drugs were their path to quick success. Their names would soon become infamous: Joseph Michael Hull, Hubert Jankowski, and Michael Harvey Ward. They were not hardened gangsters or seasoned criminals. They were barely into adulthood, but together they chose a path that would leave a permanent mark on their lives. Joseph Hull was 23. In many ways, he was the anchor of the group. He carried himself with confidence, often acting as if he were untouchable. Hull's role was not only to organize, but also to set the tone of the operation. He believed that Scarborough was small enough to control, yet lucrative enough to make serious money. His arrogance grew as the line expanded. What he saw as leadership was, in truth, recklessness. By pushing the CJ Line forward with such boldness, Hull made himself the face of a criminal enterprise. Hubert Jankowski, at 24, was the oldest of the trio, though only by a year. He was different in personality, quieter at times, but his involvement was no less significant. Jankowski played a vital part in keeping the system running smoothly. He understood logistics, the kind of behind-the-scenes coordination that allowed their texts, deliveries, and payments to flow. While Hull projected dominance, Jankowski kept the gears turning. Without him, the CJ line might have faltered, but his willingness to support the scheme only dragged him deeper into the conspiracy. Then there was Michael Harvey Ward, the youngest at just 21. Ward's age stood out because he had barely crossed the threshold into adulthood when he became a criminal conspirator. His presence gave the group a sense of bold energy, almost a recklessness that matched Hull's arrogance. For Ward, the attraction seemed to be the lifestyle, the money, the status, the thrill of running with a crew that appeared unstoppable. But that same thrill blinded him to the reality. Every move they made was being watched, and every text they sent was sealing their fate. Together, the three created a dangerous balance. Hull provided direction, Jankowski gave structure, and Ward brought ambition and drive. They reinforced one another, turning what might have been petty dealing into an organized line that could dominate Scarborough's streets. Yet this unity also became their weakness. Each man's actions tied the others more tightly to the conspiracy. When investigators began connecting the dots, there was no separating one role from the other. All three were trapped in the same web. Their story is not just about crime, but about youth consumed by ambition. They were young enough to have built different futures, yet they chose cocaine as their currency and arrogance as their strategy. In their minds, the CJ line was a clever business. In reality, it was a ticking clock. Every deal, every text, every risky decision brought them closer to the day they would stand in court, no longer as ambitious young men chasing success, but as defendants facing years behind bars. The fall of the CJ line began long before the three young men realized it. In June 2024, North Yorkshire Police launched an investigation into the network. What started as whispers of suspicious activity soon evolved into a carefully coordinated operation designed to expose every layer of the conspiracy. Detectives knew they could not rely on a single raid or arrest. They needed evidence strong enough to dismantle the line completely and leave no room for escape. The first breakthrough came from the very system the gang relied upon: their mass text messages. The CJ line pushed out offers for cocaine at all hours, confident that volume and speed would drown out suspicion. But those very texts provided police with a blueprint of the operation. Each phone number, each coded phrase, became a breadcrumb leading detectives closer to the men behind the screen. Warrants were secured, phones were tracked, and a pattern began to emerge. Surveillance teams watched as deals unfolded. They saw handovers in public spaces, quick exchanges on street corners, and vehicles making short, suspicious journeys across Scarborough. Every movement was documented. The men might have thought they were blending into the crowd, but detectives were quietly building a case that left little to the imagination. The arrogance of the gang only made their task easier. Hull, Jankowski, and Ward continued their routine, unaware that the law was already one step ahead. Then came the first arrests. Police moved in, detaining members of the network and seizing mobile phones packed with evidence. But even behind bars, the CJ line refused to fold. Using new handsets smuggled into circulation, the men kept the line alive. Cocaine was still being sold under the same brand, a defiant message that they would not be silenced. For detectives, this persistence was both a challenge and an opportunity. The longer the gang tried to continue, the deeper they dug themselves into the conspiracy. The investigation intensified. Officers analyzed thousands of text messages, tracking the flow of cocaine through the town. Surveillance logs stacked up, linking faces to phone numbers and numbers to drug deliveries. Each warrant brought more seizures, more evidence, and more cracks in the CJ line's structure. The detectives were patient, resisting the temptation to strike too soon. They wanted to ensure that when the case reached court, the evidence would be overwhelming. It was a slow, methodical pursuit, but one that revealed the truth, piece by piece. By late 2024, the CJ line was no longer a shadowy rumor whispered on Scarborough's streets. It was a fully mapped network, its leaders identified, its methods exposed, and its arrogance laid bare. The police had what they needed, a conspiracy charge backed by undeniable proof. Yet even as the net closed around them, the three men seemed convinced they could continue. Their texts carried on, their deals repeated, their confidence unshaken. It was the greatest irony of all. The very system that gave them power, the phone line that promised profit and reach, was the same system that documented their every crime. Each message, each delivery, each reckless decision was another nail in the coffin of the CJ line. By the time the operation was ready to move into its final stage, detectives had everything: surveillance records, seized drugs, digital evidence, and a clear timeline of how the gang had poisoned their community. The young men had believed they were untouchable. The truth was that the law had been standing right behind them all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In January 2025, the investigation that had quietly been building for months finally came to its climax. Officers had been tracking movements, gathering intelligence, and slowly piecing together the scale of the Scarborough gang's cocaine operation. By this point, detectives were confident they had enough evidence not only to make arrests, but to secure convictions. It was no longer a question of if the net would close, but when. The arrests were carried out with precision. Early morning raids saw the key members of the group taken into custody. Mobile phones were seized, each one containing incriminating messages about drug orders and payments, hidden cash, cocaine prepared for street-level dealing, and even makeshift weapons were uncovered. Among the items was a knuckle duster, which one of the young men claimed he carried only for protection. The excuse rang hollow. To the police, it symbolized the dangerous edge of their enterprise, a reminder that drug dealing rarely exists without the threat of violence. From the outset, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The Crown Prosecution Service built its case on intercepted messages, witness statements, and forensic analysis linking the men to drug distribution. The strength of this file meant that, when the time came, the defendants chose not to fight the charges in a drawn-out trial. By June 2025, all three had entered guilty pleas. Their admissions did not erase the damage they had caused, but they signaled the end of a criminal chapter that had unsettled the Scarborough community. The courtroom hearings carried an air of inevitability. Family members sat in silence as the details of the drug ring were read aloud. The men, once brimming with the arrogance of quick money, now appeared subdued, dressed plainly. Heads bowed as they faced the judge. Each message retrieved from their phones, each bag of cocaine catalogued, was laid out in clear, methodical fashion. The story that emerged was not one of masterminds, but of young men blinded by the illusion of easy profit, unaware of how short-lived their success would be. The judge's remarks cut to the heart of the matter. He acknowledged their youth, but stressed that drug crime corrodes communities, feeding addiction and bringing violence to the streets. He reminded them that their actions had ripple effects far beyond their immediate circle, staining Scarborough with fear and distrust. The presence of the knuckle duster was singled out, not because it had been used, but because it revealed the reality of where their choices were leading, toward intimidation, and potentially worse. Sentencing followed swiftly. One of the men received 4 years in prison, the harshest penalty, reflecting his deeper involvement in coordinating the network. Another was handed a sentence of 3 years and 4 months. The third, whose role was smaller but still significant, was given 3 years. None were spared the weight of prison time. For a gang that once imagined themselves untouchable, the fall was steep and decisive. As the gavel fell and the young men were led away, the message was unmistakable. Scarborough's drug ring had been dismantled not by violence or rivalry, but by patience, persistence, and the rule of law. What began as a story of ambition ended in prison sentences that left little doubt about the cost of chasing fast money through crime. When the dust settled and the young men were locked away, the focus shifted to the damage they had left behind. This wasn't just a story about a few reckless dealers. It was about how cocaine crept into Scarborough's neighborhoods, changing lives in ways the gang never seemed to care about. Families spoke of children lured by the false promise of quick money, while others described the fear that came with knowing drugs were circulating openly in their streets. Behind every bag of cocaine was a ripple effect of addiction, broken trust, and shattered futures. Detective Constable Tomlinson, who helped lead the investigation, did not hold back when speaking about the case. He made it clear that the gang's actions went far beyond lining their own pockets. In his words, drug dealing destroys communities and ruins families. His statement wasn't just about Scarborough, it reflected a wider truth across the country. Cocaine wasn't simply an illegal trade, it was a poison spreading through working-class areas already under strain. The police highlighted how dangerous it was to underestimate the scale of harm caused by these so-called local dealers. While the gang may have seen themselves as clever entrepreneurs, the reality was starkly different. Their greed fueled addiction and pulled more young people into a cycle of crime and dependency. For many parents, the case was a chilling reminder that the promise of easy cash often ends in prison or worse. The sight of teenagers slipping into criminal networks hit too close to home. Community frustration had been building long before the arrests. Residents had reported suspicious activity, the constant presence of strangers, and the anxiety of knowing drugs were being pushed near schools and homes. What the police operation achieved was not only to break up the supply chain, but to give residents back a sense of safety. It was proof that persistence could pay off, even against a gang that believed they were untouchable. In his closing remarks, Detective Constable Tomlinson stressed the importance of deterrence. The sentences handed down were not just punishments, but warnings. "Let this be a message to anyone who thinks dealing drugs is a quick way to make money," he said. "We will find you, we will build the evidence, and you will face the consequences." His words carried weight because they were backed by action. The Scarborough gang had gambled with their futures and lost. For the community, the case was both a relief and a reminder of how high the stakes remain in the fight against drugs. The Scarborough case carries lessons that reach far beyond one seaside town. It showed how even small communities are not immune to the lure of cocaine and the networks that supply it. Many people imagine drug empires as sprawling operations run from big cities. Yet here, a handful of young men believed they could carve out their own criminal business in plain sight. Their story highlights a sobering truth. Small-town networks can be just as destructive, drawing in vulnerable people and feeding addiction under the radar. The arrogance of the dealers was another striking lesson. They acted as if the law could not touch them, continuing their activities even when the police were already closing in. They saw themselves as untouchable, mistaking youthful bravado for power. In the end, their confidence proved to be their downfall. The case underlined how quickly drug dealers can go from thinking they control the streets to standing powerless in a courtroom, facing years in prison. Just as important was the resilience of the police investigation. Detectives pieced together the evidence with patience, using surveillance and coordination across agencies to build a watertight case. It reminded the public that, while drug gangs might adapt and hide, law enforcement adapts too. The Scarborough operation showed that persistence, even against local networks, can bring lasting results. For communities, the lesson is equally clear. Drug crime does not only destroy individual lives, it corrodes entire neighborhoods. But cases like this also prove that determined policing, backed by community awareness, can reclaim those same streets. Scarborough's experience stands as both a warning and a reassurance. Crime may flourish for a while, but it never goes unanswered. The young men who thought they could rewrite the rules of their town instead became a cautionary tale of where drug crime inevitably leads. In the end, the Scarborough Gang's story is not one of success or power, but of wasted youth and ruined potential. These were not hardened veterans of crime, but ordinary young men who believed they could outsmart the system and profit from dealing cocaine. They convinced themselves they were clever, that the money and status would make them untouchable. Instead, they found themselves shackled by the very arrogance that drove them. Prison became the final destination of a path they thought would lead to glory. Their choices didn't just cost them their freedom. The damage stretched far beyond their circle. Every deal made on Scarborough's streets left behind a scar. Addiction tore into families. Trust within neighborhoods was eroded. And the sense of safety ordinary people depend on was shattered. The gang may have imagined themselves as entrepreneurs, but in truth, they were fueling misery. The true profit of their trade was measured not in cash, but in broken lives and fractured communities. What makes their downfall so stark is the contrast between their youth and their decisions. At an age when most are finding careers, building relationships, or shaping futures, these young men were instead dragged into courtrooms, facing judges who saw only recklessness and greed. Their names became headlines for all the wrong reasons, and their years of freedom were replaced with prison sentences that will follow them for the rest of their lives. For Scarborough, this case sent a strong and unmissable message. The town will not tolerate drug crime. The coordinated police investigation, the decisive arrests, and the firm sentences all stood as proof that no matter how discreet or confident a network believes itself to be, the law will catch up. The resilience of investigators showed the community that persistence pays off, and the public statements from officers made clear that every bag of cocaine seized was one less chance for lives to be ruined. And yet, for all the lessons and deterrents, there remains a haunting question. When those young men sit in their cells, replaying their choices and watching their futures slip further away, what goes through their minds? Was the rush of quick money enough to outweigh the years stolen from their lives? Was the fleeting sense of power worth the lasting damage left behind? This case will be remembered in Scarborough not for the gang's ambition, but for their failure. It stands as a cautionary tale for any who might think the drug trade offers a way forward. Because at the end of every story like this, the conclusion is always the same. Lives destroyed, communities harmed, and futures lost. And for those who still dare to follow the same path, the question will always echo louder than before. Was it worth it?